All right, let's get started. The assignment number one, which is talking about computer simulation. Here are the three basic topics we're going to cover. Relationship between computer simulation and scientific computing. Make compare of simulation versus games. Third one is how to determine channels of a computer simulation versus games as of communication to and from the user. So, computer simulation is basically building an entire system uh, operating on complex method to achieve a certain goal. Scientific computing basically just building a program. The program itself is problem oriented. It is meant to solve a certain technical problem. But for simulation, it's hard to tell what it is oriented. Probably we can see it's demand oriented. We just need to achieve the goal. So simulation is more complex. It it could be a combination of a lot scientific computing. Well, on the other hand, the scientific computing is relatively simple because it only need to consider a certain problem from a certain aspects. So let's say scientific computing could be the fundamental of simulation. Simulation just use multiple scientific computings to resolve serious issues, technical issues, and to achieve a certain goal. Second topic, simulation versus games. Let's firstly take a look at the most outstanding uh, comparison, which is devices. So here, a projector, a keyboard, and a mouse. Well, as long as it satisfies the operational demands of a simulation, then that's fine. This device is certainly enough to work. For game, well, on the other hand, it could be use the same basic I/O devices, or it could be more fancy. Well, talking about the fancy, what if we level up? Let's say we need to do a complex simulation. We need to play big games. The result is, well, we can do. As you can see here, this is a simulation of like tank driver training system. So the device is pretty fancy enough from my standpoint. Well, this is the world's biggest game machine. Well, let's say if we build the game machine more serious and we make the simulation devices more fancy, do they look the same or do they look similar? Well, I think the answer is yes. So basically, from the device perspective, we are not easy to tell the difference between simulation and game. We can just say, well, that those two things are built from like a very different original goal. Well, let's take a look into other properties and make more detailed comparison between simulation and game. So computer technical applied for simulation, well, that's for sure. For game, yes. Well, anyway, Xbox is a computer. So the second one is fantastic. Well, for simulation, it's highly unlikely because it is not needed. But for game, well, highly likely, yes, because fantastic will have more, well, much better user experience. Realistic, for simulation, maybe not, but usually, yes. For game, maybe yes, but usually it's not. Frivolous for simulation, highly likely. Well, it is to solve a serious issue. It is to do a serious things. So it probably could be tedious. But for game, well, highly unlikely, unless it's a bad game. Practical. Yeah, for simulation, it should be. Otherwise, why are we building this simulation? But for game, it's not required. It could probably be practical, but it's not required and it's not necessary. Visualization combined with dry or numeric. Well, the answer is basically yes for simulation. The only difference is visualization for simulation is not a must. It depends on its need. But for game, well, usually the visualization is a must. And uh, numeric thing, well, highly unlikely. So this is probably the most ordinary example of the simulation and numeric things simulation versus games. So the simulation visualization is more serious. It could be a workflow, a code, or a data, a chat. But for game, well, yeah, it has to be fancy. It's better to be fancy. Uh, well, here is just some basic difference. So let's take a look into another set of properties. Control. Yes, for simulation, we do need control as long as it is necessary. We don't want to disrupt too much in the process. But for game, well, yeah, the control, usually it's a lot. Well, unless it's a strategy game. Rules and constraints, the answer is yes for both simulation and game. But simulation is based on real physics, even though you're simulating a ridiculous things, but it still has to be based on the real physics, real factors, real scientists. But for game, it probably not. Well, even though you're playing on a magic word game, the magic still has to follow the magic rules. But it's based on setting. It doesn't need to be based on the real world. And the state, well, for simulation, yep, when the result achieved, when the goal achieved, well, there will be end state. For game, that means journey and story reaches to the end, but it's not necessary. Some games are endless. Feedback, well, I think that's a more important one. For a game, usually it will be a lot instant feedback to attractive the players to be attractive for players so that the players could be more dedicated into the game so that the game more entertainment. But for simulation, the feedback usually it doesn't require like instant feedback or like score uh, or like a compromise. But it just depends on its need. If it is a training system like training driver, well, sure, the feedback is important and has to be instant, but just depends on the need. So I think the biggest difference is the purpose, or we should say the ultimate goal. For simulation, uh, the goal is to achieve what desired, what demand, what we designed. So it's not a simple thing. But for game, answer is entertainment. That's the ultimate goal for game. So I think that's the biggest difference between simulation and a game. Even though there are serious games, but still, the goal is not entertainment. Uh, Depends on the need. So the last topic is communication channels. Actually, we have already partially answered these questions during topic number two. So the communication channels for simulation, as long as operational requirement is satisfied, any devices, any channels we can use. The simple projector as output, the simple keyboard and mouse as input devices, that should be fine. Or if we do need high level communication, like the user need achieve more control for the training purposes, well, yeah, we could add more channels. But usually for a simulation, it just depends on the demand and depends on the design of that simulation. The channels could be command line, could be the keyboard, could be a simple projector. That's sufficient. Well, as long as it works, that should be good. So the channels could be limited. But for game, on the other hand, besides of playing, add more entertainment element as much as possible is always the choosing goal of game because in the goal of game is to add entertainment. So besides of basic I/O devices, besides of those basic channels, the user would always want to have like more fancy input and output games to gain more entertainment. So depends on the ultimate goal. The channels could be wires. Well, that's all for this presentation. Thank you for listening, and that's all.